We all have our favorite iconic movie, but they nearly looked very, very different. Imagine a world where McDonald's sells tacos, or where Shakespeare wrote Hallmark movies, or where Cardi B's music is actually good. You can't, right? Well now, imagine some of your favorite movies, but where the hero isn't actually very heroic. A romance movie without the romance, or a family-friendly movie which is scarier than the moment your parents caught you listening to WAP. I'm a grown man, Mom! I can listen to what I want! Anyway, the reason we mention this is because a number of iconic and fan-favorite movies almost looked very different, with some having plots so bonkers that Ryan George would have a field day. In this video, we will take a look at 15-ish movies that were nearly very, very, very different. From classic movies originally having crazy storylines, directors with totally different visions, and famous bands trying to buy movie rights, get ready to enter a Rick and Morty-style portal as we enter another dimension where classic movies look very different. P.S. I'm sorry about that diss earlier, Cardi. I love you, really. Now, you might already know this, but the inspiration for George Lucas's A New Hope was a mix of westerns and samurai movies, and the movie's plot was comparable to Akira Kurosawa's Hidden Fortress. But in the initial script for Star Wars, it was much more comparable to Lawrence of Arabia, which involved Luke going by the name Anakin Starkiller, Han Solo being a green-skinned alien with gills, a 14-year-old Princess Leia who Luke punches in the face, and a tribe of Ewok-sized Wookiees. In the original script, Starkiller is sent to take out the Death Star among a squadron of young rebel fighters where he's trained by a Jedi general named Luke Skywalker. So you can see the similarities, but it was all very different, with one of the biggest changes being the title, which was initially The Adventures of Luke Starkiller as taken from the Journal of the Whills, Saga 1, The Star Wars. Yeah, try saying that 10 times fast. Thankfully, with some assistance, Lucas ended up writing the Star Wars we all know, as well as reducing the title to something you can actually say in under 10 seconds. Seeing as there are more Spider-Man movies than there were Spider-Man and Into the Spider-Verse, it might be surprising to know it did take a while for Spidey to actually make it to the big screen. Before Raimi's Spider-Man movie back in 2002, James Cameron had been working on a Spidey movie a decade earlier before entering into a bitter legal matter over payment. In the first iteration, Cameron took a previously unused Spider-Man script and made some bizarre changes to it, where Doc Ock was the villain, but was actually Peter Parker's physics professor who also ends up being bitten by a radioactive spider. His second version would have had Electro as the main villain, with Sandman as his muscle, with Electro being a rich businessman named Carlton Strand, who is brutally killed by Spider-Man at the end of the movie after kidnapping Mary Jane. The movie would have been a lot darker than the Raimi movies, and also planned to have Maguire's good friend Leonardo DiCaprio playing our favorite web-slinger. Another Marvel movie which was supposed to have a very different villain was one of the first entries in the MCU, Iron Man. Instead of Jeff Bridges' Obadiah Stane being the main villain, it would have been one of Tony's main enemies from the comics, the Mandarin, as the villain, with Stane playing a much smaller role. The Mandarin would have been a Tony counterpart, also rich and a businessman, but was ultimately scrapped. The character kind of turned up in Iron Man 3 before the controversial twist, but will be playing a big part in the MCU in the upcoming Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. Like Spider-Man, X-Men was another comic book movie that was stuck in development for some time. The initial plan for the movie saw Magneto invading and taking over Manhattan and blowing up the bridges to stop people getting in, similar to what Bane does in The Dark Knight Rises. However, instead of planning to blow up the city, Magneto forced a human evacuation through Harlem and sought to turn Manhattan into a mutant refuge. Because nowhere is as quiet and out of the way as Manhattan. We also learned that Magneto was at fault for the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, which would have made the HBO miniseries very different. In terms of book-to-film adaptations, Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings did a pretty good job, but it could have looked a lot different. That's because, in the 60s, the Beatles were looking to acquire the rights to the books as they were big fans and were inspired by Tolkien's work. Their plan was to make it a psychedelic epic where Paul McCartney played Frodo, Ringo Starr played Sam, George Harrison would play Gandalf, and amazingly, John Lennon would have been Gollum. But what is even more interesting is the fact that they wanted the great Stanley Kubrick to direct it, as they thought his vision and scope would be perfect for the movie. Man, the amount of money I would pay to see this movie. Kubrick eventually passed, as while he was a fan of the books, thought that the movies would be too complex and instead focused on 2001: A Space Odyssey. Yeah, because that wasn't complex. When the band approached Tolkien to purchase the rights, he refused as he wasn't a fan of their music or vision. Maybe he would have preferred Cardi B. Since we're on the subject of Kubrick, the director had a number of passions that he never got to do, with his Napoleon epic being one of the most unfortunate movies never to be made. But one that did get made was AI, Artificial Intelligence, and Kubrick was set to direct the movie, but sadly died before production started, with Spielberg being brought in to replace him. Kubrick's version of AI, Artificial Intelligence, was certainly one of the most intriguing what-ifs of all time. Kubrick's planned ending for Dr. Strangelove was also very different, with his initial ending involving a pie fight in the war room. Yeah, that one I'm glad didn't happen. The cult comedy Anchorman is so popular due to its ever-popular quotes and bizarre storyline. But the original plan for the movie was even more bizarre. Will Ferrell said on the Bill Simmons podcast that the original story involved the news team crashing a plane into the mountains before being hunted down by a group of orangutans who used Chinese throwing stars to take out the news team one by one. Yes, this is a real plot.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
The movie was rejected 10 times before eventually being made into the movie we now know, and let's face it, that's probably for the best.
Cannonball!
Another cult comedy that was nearly very different is The Truman Show, which was initially a sci-fi thriller based off of a Twilight Zone episode. Scarface director Brian De Palma was attached to the initial project before the studio brought in Peter Weir to helm a lighter version. Screenwriter Andrew Niccol reportedly drafted the script 24 times before Weir was finally happy with it, but Niccol's work didn't go to waste, with him incorporating the original themes into the movie Gattaca.
In case I don't see ya. Good afternoon, good evening, and good night.
One of the reasons Twilight gets a hard time is because it's seen as a sappy love story involving vampires and werewolves. Well, when Paramount bought the rights to the books, they were worried it would be seen in this light too, and wanted to turn the movie into a Blade meets Predator action movie where Edward battles swaths of SWAT teams with martial arts expertise as well as vampire hunters. Bella would also have been a more traditional action heroine who would go around kicking butt. Paramount eventually decided to scrap this and go with a movie more in keeping with the books, but hands up if you want to see this version. I can't see you, but I imagine there's a lot. It wasn't just Twilight and The Truman Show that was nearly a lot darker, but Toy Story as well. In the first version, Woody was actually the villain and was reminiscent of a creepy ventriloquist doll and ended up trying to kill Buzz after becoming jealous. The producers were so scarred by the original cut that the filmmakers quickly changed it to the movie we now know, with Woody and Buzz having a much friendlier relationship. This is also similar to Frozen, which very nearly had Elsa as the main villain of the movie, who was originally much more of a typical Disney villain. Alien is one of the scariest and best pieces of sci-fi horror ever made, and that is in part due to the terror caused by the xenomorph. But that was all nearly very different in the original draft, which was called Star Beast, where the titular Star Beast was actually a large tentacled beast more reminiscent of the facehuggers than the sneaky xenomorph. This was eventually changed to the creature we now know, but the ending was almost different, with the xenomorph killing the entire crew, Ripley included, and impersonating Ripley's voice while speaking into the crew log. I don't know if that's more or less creepy. Another movie focusing on an alien but is supposedly less scary is E.T., although my childhood nightmares would like to argue differently. Look at him, he's terrifying! I can't do this, it's bringing back all these memories, I don't want to have a nightmare again. It's okay, he can't hurt you now, it's just a movie. Anyway, while you may not have found it as scary as me, Spielberg's original plans were meant to be a whole lot scarier, with it instead being called Night Skies, about a group of aliens who terrorize a family. E.T. is the only one who befriends them and tries to protect them as his group tries to wipe them out. Eventually, Spielberg was convinced to change the story to just focus on the family-friendly alien and make it more suited for kids. Suited for kids? Oh yeah, well how come I wet the bed till I was 15, huh? Did I actually just say that? Another Spielberg movie that was supposed to be a lot more violent is Jurassic Park. Apparently, author Michael Crichton's first draft was a lot more violent, expositional, and expensive to film, so Spielberg had to bring in a bunch of writers to try and tone this all down, and again was made to be a little bit more family-friendly. Who you gonna call? That's right, it's Carly Rae Jepsen. Yes, I nailed the 2012 joke. Alright, I meant the Ghostbusters. Ghostbusters is one of the most iconic and loved sci-fi comedies of all time, and that is in part due to its eccentricities. But it was almost even stranger. In Dan Aykroyd's original Ghost Smashers concept, the Ghost Hunters were actually more akin to Jedi Knights and would travel through alternate dimensions, taking down the ghosts with space wands instead of proton packs. The only similarity between Smashers and Busters was the giant Marshmallow Man, but with costs being rather extreme, it was scaled back considerably to make it an actually affordable movie.
Mother hush bucket.
When you think of Back to the Future, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is the DeLorean. But originally, instead of the DeLorean, Doc Brown traveled time in a fridge, and in the original script, a suicidal Marty gets into the fridge to take his own life. But seeing as that's not exactly a fun storyline, they decided to change it. But at first, the fridge stayed the same, with it only working after Marty accidentally spills Coca-Cola on it. In this version, Doc lives in an abandoned theater and has a pet monkey instead of a dog, and Marty's reasoning for going into the past is that he's chased by government operatives. Other than that, the general beats were the same, with Marty changing the future after going into the past, but overall it would have been a very, very different movie. So what did you make of this list? Are there any you wish you could have seen? Any we missed? Let us know in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe to the channel today for this and more interesting content.